what do the two of you already know about mindfulness, if anything?
Not a lot.
Yeah. When you think of mindfulness, how would you define it? How would you tell somebody else about it?
I think it's a growing awareness of your surroundings and of your body, in space in your surroundings.
Yeah, being attentive to myself in the space that I am in and to whatever is around me.
Yeah, absolutely. So what I'm hearing there is sort of a paying attention on purpose,
Mm.
being intentional, and that you're focusing on what's happening in any given moment around you on the present moment. It can be inside you or your surroundings. So those are good definitions. A third sort of aspect that I like to add when I'm talking about mindfulness is also that we do that without judgment. So a lot of times when we are paying attention to what's happening in the present moment, we're not happy about what's happening in the present moment. And
Mm.
that kind of makes us miserable too. We don't want things to be the way they are. And so when we can practice mindfulness, we are focusing on what's happening in the present moment with intention, but we're also doing that in a way that's open and curious so that we see what's there just for what it is. So, part of the reason I think that's helpful, that practice of mindfulness, is that our brains get used to thinking in certain ways. And so for some of us, we tend to be worriers, right? We worry about what's going to happen. And, we might call that anxiety or stress, um, or fear that there's stuff that's going to happen off in the future. And our brains work really hard to prepare us and protect us. Sometimes, though, that sort of rehearsing for the future can result in suffering because sometimes there's nothing we can do about the future. And all of the imagining and catastrophizing and thinking about all the possible scenarios and what we might do if that happens, maybe it's helpful, but a lot of times it's not. And so when our brains are in that pattern of always looking out for what's next, then our brains get really good at that. That just becomes a way of thinking. For some people, and sometimes the same people, there's more of a past focus of thinking about something that somebody did wrong, something that we did wrong, something that didn't go the way we wanted it to. And so we spend some time thinking about what should have happened, what we could have done better, beating ourselves up or other people up for mistakes that were made. And that doesn't necessarily have to be a bad thing, right? Sometimes when we do make a mistake, it's important to look at what happened and figure out what we can learn from it. But a lot of times our brains go a little bit too far down that road and we get pretty miserable about stuff that can't be changed. And we kind of live back there. Sometimes we call that rehashing versus rehearsing, right? And so when we think that way a lot, our brains, again, get used to that sort of churning of what has already happened. And at some point, that might not be helpful either. And, too, it can be kind of a positive thing. You're looking back at something that has happened that used to be good, right? So, a business or a church or a group that used to be thriving and isn't in the present. And so it's easier to kind of live in the past and bury our heads about what's happening now and just sort of wish that it could be the way that it was. But that's not necessarily helpful either. And so, what mindfulness does when we practice it regularly is it helps us to be in the present, not in sort of a Pollyanna, everything's wonderful way, but it helps us to tolerate and even welcome what's happening right in front of us and not live so much in the past or in the future. I mean, how many of us sort of live in this world of stress, right? We feel stressed, we feel overwhelmed, and that feels like it's happening in the present. But a lot of times it's really coming from stuff that needs to be done, or something terrible is going to happen, right? Or stuff that we've committed to and we're overcommitted. We don't have clarity about what's important to us, and we're just reacting to things that are happening. And it feels like we don't have a lot of control over what's happening in our lives. So, with mindfulness, we get to live a more meaningful, rich life because we're appreciating what's right in front of us, even if it's not the most wonderful thing that's right in front of us. And so I'll stop there. I'll see if you have questions or reactions to what I've said so far.
Helpful, very helpful, and accurate. How the brain works, and so yeah. So then it makes me curious about how to situate myself, how to help myself be situated in the moment.
Yeah, I find of the rehearsing versus the rehatching, that's it's like different gears of the car, and I feel like I'm often doing one or the other. I'm not usually neutral. So
Mm-hmm.
similarly to what Kelly says, there's stress and there's momentum and there's background radiation of all that's about to happen or did happen. How does it work to be present when you are frequently affected and afflicted by what you're worried about to happen or before, and that carries itself and rests in the present moment that you're trying to negate?
Right. So it's actually the trying to negate that is part of the issue. So, yes, of course, when we're sitting down and trying to have a moment of quiet, or when we're trying to focus on a task, a to do on our list, and it's difficult to just sit down and do that work because our brains are swirling. If you try to negate, when you push back against a thought, a lot of times what happens is that it pushes back even harder. And so by saying, I'm not going to think about that, that's like if I tell you not to picture a pink elephant, well, now you're picturing a pink elephant, right? And so a lot of what we're doing with mindfulness is allowing and opening to what is, so that we're not struggling with it. We're not engaging with it, which then forces it to come back even stronger. So let me give you an example. With mindfulness meditation, what you're doing, I think a lot of people think that meditation is, sitting with your legs crossed and your fingers like this, and having a completely clear mind, not allowing thoughts to intrude, becoming at one with the universe or at one with God, or, that there's some transcendental purpose to it. And for some forms of meditation, that's true. That is what you're doing. But with mindfulness meditation, all you're doing is practicing that ability to intentionally focus on the present moment without judgment. And we do that by using our senses. So most of us have five senses, right? There's what we can see, there's what we can hear, there's what we can feel, touch, sensation with our bodies, there's smelling, there's tasting, right? So there are all these things that we can practice with. And a lot of times, what we do with mindfulness meditation is, sit mostly still, but it doesn't have to be still. And we do something like focus on what it feels like to breathe. And the reason we oftentimes focus on breath is because unless there's an issue with our breathing, it's always there for us. So we don't have to have a recording on our phone. We don't have to have certain kind of music. We don't have to have a certain kind of environment. we can just always focus on the breath because it's right there. And it's something we don't tend to pay attention to. So when we do pay attention to it, it's a little bit of a different experience. But you can also focus on sound. I really like to use sound as an anchor, as a point of focus, because it's always changing, right? I can get a little bit bored by focusing on my breath. But with sound, there's always something new. Um, but I think it's good to focus on lots of different things and play around with it. So why don't we try just a really brief breath focused meditation? And I will start by saying, when we do this, almost certainly your mind will wander. Thoughts will come. You'll start thinking about whatever is after this, what you're going to have for lunch, or something that happened in the past, or you'll wonder whether you're doing it right, or you'll think this is boring or this is stupid or whatever, right? All these thoughts will come because that's what our brains do. Our brains are trying to protect us. That's how they work. But whenever that happens, when a thought comes, the practice is in noticing that there's a thought and gently bringing the attention back to the breath over and over and over. And you'll find that when you practice meditation regularly, daily is great, even if it's just for a few minutes, you get better and better at realizing that your brain has taken you somewhere and just coming back to the breath. And you get better and better at doing that without judging yourself like you're making a mistake, because it's not a mistake. It's not a problem. It is what our brains do. It's an opportunity to practice mindfulness. So let's give it a try. I think a lot of times it is easiest to meditate with the eyes closed because we sort of remove one of those external stimuli of sight. But for some people, closing their eyes and meditating doesn't feel safe. It doesn't feel comfortable. And you can absolutely meditate with your eyes open too. If you do, what's helpful is to not necessarily look at something in particular, but just to sort of lower the eyes and have a soft gaze where you're kind of looking at this indistinct point on the floor in front of you. If you're sitting, which we are at the moment, you can kind of move your way into a comfortable position. So there's not any particular way you have to sit, but it can be helpful if you're sitting to have both feet on the floor so that you kind of feel the ground beneath you, and to have a position that is simultaneously alert and relaxed so that you're not overly rigid, but you're not like leaning back so that you're gonna like fall asleep, right? So I'll invite you to close your eyes if that's comfortable for you. And primarily what we're working with here is physical sensation. So we can sit here and notice what it feels like to sit. So noticing where the feet are in contact with the floor and how the body is supported by the chair. Not just this cognitive realization that we're sitting in a chair, but noticing the physical sensations of where the body is in contact with some other surface. Just kind of scanning everywhere that the body is touching something. And that it's not just furniture or the ground that's touching us, but also the clothing that we're wearing. We kind of take for granted, unless there's some uncomfortable aspect of the clothing, We just stop noticing that there's this contact against the skin. And where there is no clothing, our skin is in contact with the air. Maybe it's moving a little bit because there's a fan overhead, or if we're outside for some reason, we might feel a little bit of wind. But usually there's a temperature difference between the air and our skin. Depends, of course, on the time of year. But we can take this moment to notice what we can feel through the skin. And you might notice when I stop talking that the mind kind of has a will of its own. Maybe there was a little stream of consciousness that went from skin to temperature to something else. But if that happened, you can gently notice where it went and bring focus, intentional focus, back to what the body feels like as it sits. And then we can shift our focus from this sort of outside sensation of the body, where it's in contact with things that are around us, moving inward to focus on the sensation of breath. And if you haven't focused on the breath before, it might not be obvious exactly how to do that. So one thing you can do is choose to breathe more deeply if you'd like to. Just take some deep breaths where you breathe in through the nostrils, hold it for just a little bit, and then breathe out, even audibly, through the lips. And as you do this sort of rhythmic motion, you might notice that when you inhale, the whole body sort of lifts up, the chest expands. There's a little bit of tension that gets created when we breathe in. And then when we breathe out, it's kind of like we're coming back to neutral, to revisit Jared's driving analogy. We come back to this point of rest. We let go. There's almost this downward motion with each out breath. So we, talk about the rise and the fall of the breath. There really is literally a rising of the body and a falling of the body with each inhale and exhale. And we don't just notice that movement, we feel that movement. We can feel the movement of our bodies in response to the breath, and we can feel the movement of the breath through the body. We can notice the sensation in the nostrils. as it moves down the throat and into the lungs. And then with the exhale, again, we can feel that movement through the nostrils, through the mouth. Even as we return to a regular pace and rhythm of breathing, not needing to breathe more deeply, no right or wrong way to breathe. Just breathing as the body does and noticing it. Occasionally, a thought or a sound might capture the attention. Pull the focus away for a moment. And as soon as we realize that that's happened, we are back in the present moment, intentionally focusing. And you might notice my gentle guidance to help you with judgment that sometimes comes. To just notice things as they are with this sense of openness and curiosity, as if you've never breathed before and you're exploring that for the first time, like a scientist or a creature from outer space. And as we come to the end of this tiny practice, we can once again notice what it feels like to sit in the chair. Notice the ground beneath the feet. And if your eyes were open, I mean closed, if your eyes were closed, you can open them and begin to take in your surroundings. And then I think an important aspect of any meditation, whether you're doing it on your own or especially with a group, is to just take a moment before you dive back into life and reflect on what you noticed, what the body maybe felt like before and after, what thoughts did come, what did you experience as you took that time?
I really noticed, I mean, I chose this shirt that I have on, but I noticed how this is my very favorite shirt because it's really soft and it's really comfortable, and it made me happy. And
Mhm.
so, and I kind of ignore that most of the time. I think, oh, there's my shirt and I like it, but I don't think about it too much. But it made it much more enjoyable to sit and be present. Yeah.
Yeah.
I think I noticed a lot of tension in my shoulders, like up in here, as I was, getting bigger and contracting, that there was resistance that I think was able to let go of
Hmm.
um, the more I was present with it.
Right. So part of what I think is valuable also about mindfulness is that sometimes we don't even realize where there's tension in the body or where there's some kind of suffering because of what we're doing with our minds. And if we don't realize something is happening, then it's really very difficult to do anything about it. And so having that time to just sort of notice what's happening in the body doesn't necessarily fix it. But I think the act of breathing sort of creates this movement where we're not tightening up against something to make it go away. Or so we either open up around what we notice and are able to have a sense of relaxation, or sometimes we notice other parts of the body that aren't in tension, and by focusing there, sometimes it eases things up in the first area. So that's kind of fun. I think for some people, they also think that the goal of a mindfulness meditation is to calm down, relax, to feel peaceful. And sometimes that happens, right? That when we let go of some things, both physically and emotionally, that we do feel calmer, feel looser, feel more relaxed. But that doesn't always happen. And it's not the goal. So if we strive after, I really want to feel relaxed, we're a lot less likely to feel relaxed. It's when we focus on what's happening in the present moment that relaxation sometimes, often comes. We meditate once, maybe we get a sense of relaxation, but that benefit passes pretty quickly. I find and have found through my practice that when I regularly meditate, and I tend to like to use a guided meditation app, but you don't have to do that. You can just do it, setting aside a few minutes with a timer or something so you don't lose track of time. But that regular practice, I just find that I am less reactive and irritated in a lot of situations that would otherwise have set me right off. you know? And so when you practice mindfulness meditation on this regular basis, then you're more able to practice mindfulness generally in other situations. So if this is something that you want to explore, you can set aside some time for meditation. I think that's helpful. But you can also practice mindfulness in sort of informal ways, just living your life. So, for example, taking a shower instead of, I have really good ideas in the shower, and that's not a bad thing, but sometimes I don't even really remember what I've done, whether I remembered to wash my hair or whatever. Um, and so taking a few moments when you first get in the shower to just appreciate the warmth of the water and how it feels against the skin, to, when you apply your bath products, your soap, your body wash, your shampoo, whatever, to smell it and to appreciate the way it smells, to notice how the body feels as it begins to get clean. Just really paying attention to the sensations of that particular activity. It doesn't mean that you have to be mindful the entire time you're in the shower, because that's pretty hard, but beginning to practice those little moments. You can also do things like, if you are standing in a line, which these days there are a lot of lines to stand in 6 feet apart, to notice what's happening when we stand, both in the body, but also what do our minds take us to? If we're standing in line at a grocery store and that line's moving faster than the line we're in, noticing that sense of irritation that comes up and using mindfulness to just notice what's happening so that the importance of moving quickly becomes less of a thing. I think, and it's not like mindfulness is this total slowing down, right? You can be mindful when you're doing things quickly too. It's just this sense of willingness to allow things to be the way they are and not fight so much against reality. So, what questions do you have?
I noticed that when I was sitting, that when I was breathing, then I needed to yawn more, which I was kind of embarrassed about because I thought, oh, well, Susan is going to think I'm really not that interested. Sort of worrying about all that. But just, I, I think what I hear you saying is like giving myself permission to just do what I need to, whatever comes, and I have to do that. So something about what I was doing made me need more air or something in a different way.
And you noticed it, and you noticed the thought you had about it, and then you took care of it. It's perfect.
Are there strategies that you can implement to, maintain the sense of presence throughout the craziness of the day and those situations that are about to set you over the edge? This is great when we carve time that we can be by ourselves, quiet, alone. But most of the day, we're not by ourselves, quiet and alone.
Right. So there are lots of ways to do that. I mean, one is, for example, if you are sharing space with other people, either physically, in your home or talking to somebody on a Zoom call or a meeting, to choose to really focus on the other person. To, on a Zoom call, it's pretty hard to make eye contact, but, I always try to place the people I'm talking to right underneath the camera so that I really am looking at them with a smile on my face, and maybe they feel that too. But when they're talking, I it takes some practice, but really listening to what they're saying, and not that there's a tendency to figure out what we're going to say in response as we're listening to them talk, right? So waiting for them to stop talking so that we can respond. And we're only halfway listening to what they're saying because our brains are multitasking and thinking about what we want to say. And so if we're truly listening, as if we needed to summarize what the person was saying before we responded, that is a mindful way of interacting with other people. And our minds, of course, when we're talking to somebody else, are going to think about our to-do list, are going to think about all kinds of other things. But that's yet another opportunity to notice that the mind has wandered and come back to the conversation and to the person. And so that's a way to practice. There's also, when you're sitting down, for me, when I'm sitting down to do work and I have 15 things I could do, to slow down and take a moment and figure out what is the best next step to take. Not that there's a right answer, but I think we sort of live our lives making decisions about, am I going to do this or am I going to do that? Am I going to, am I going to be on my phone or am I going to take care of this task? And if we just slow down for a second and notice what our brains are telling us, what emotions are being raised as we consider any particular decision, and just be slightly more intentional about the decision we choose to make. Not that there's a right or a wrong thing, right? I mean, sometimes there is, but being on our phones is an example of kind of mindless activity. However, it's perfectly fine to be on our phones if we're doing that with intention and we're clear, I'm going to take a 15-minute break and play this little game, and then I'm going to get back to what I was doing, versus sitting down with the phone and 6 hours later having watched a bunch of Netflix or YouTube or some game that keeps making you want to go to the next level. That's not mindful. And we end up feeling good in the moment because we're getting these little dopamine rushes of responding to an urge. But when we're all done, it doesn't feel great. And so it's that intentionality of how we spend our time and appreciating what's there. I don't know if I answered your question, but I think there are tons of ways, and it's not like you can do it 100% of the time. That's pretty difficult. And there are times that it's fun and useful to think about the future or to remember something wonderful from the past. But when you notice that you've gotten lost in it, when you've gotten carried away, that's the opportunity to go, oh, my mind did that, and come back to where you are. So how might you personally think about incorporating mindfulness into your life?
I think taking moments to, breathe and practice the non-judgmental aspects of the errant thoughts. First thing in the morning when I'm trying to, get a pulse for the day would be a really good start.
I like that you encourage that paying attention to the sensory thing. So just the way that light comes in through the windows, or smells. And the sound was really good, even though the distractions in my house this morning are much more irritating than they were, like, but yeah. So using my senses, I think, is really helpful.
And the sense that we don't often notice as much is the sense of taste and eating. There can be mindful eating as well, right? Of being mindful about what we choose to eat and when we choose to eat. So, thinking about an urge to eat an unhealthy snack, just being thoughtful about, okay, do I really want this? If I really do want this, how much am I going to eat? And then when we are eating, to really enjoy it and appreciate it, to look at how the food looks on the plate, how it smells, how it feels in the mouth, to appreciate, you know, all that went into the making of that meal and the producing of the ingredients. I mean, there's lots of things we can do to be mindful about even that act that sometimes we're just shoveling food in our mouth while we're on our phone or watching TV or having a conversation with another person. So I like your reminder, Kelly, that we can use our senses in lots of ways. And Jared, I like what you talked about with sort of using it to start your day and to be intentional about it's almost like a mindset of how you're going to approach the day. It's also a wonderful thing to end the day with and to reflect, and to notice what's happening in the body as we begin to fall into sleep. And to, insomnia is a thing for a lot of people, but focusing on the present moment and how the body feels, at some point, either the brain gets engaged in that and can kind of allow all the other stuff to go into the background, or the brain gets bored with looking at the body and falls asleep. I mean, I think that's the beauty of counting sheep, is that at some point you just get bored with it. And it's the ability to focus on this allows that you're struggling with as you're trying to fall asleep to just fade into the background instead of going, I don't want to think about that. So I have some meditations on YouTube on lots of different topics, lots of different senses of exploring what it's like to meditate around a particular sense. And so I hope that you might explore the channel and see if there are some topics that interest you. And I'll also share some resources for apps that might be helpful if my particular voice is not a pleasing one to you, or you're looking for more of a silent meditation where you're kind of doing it on your own. But I think an app is really helpful because a lot of them will sort of give you a reminder to meditate every day. You can also put something in your calendar so that you are intentional about being mindful. So I want to thank you for being open to what I'm sharing today. I hope that you are finding ways to not just let this be in one ear and out the other, but that you'll find ways to be mindful in your life. It really makes life a lot richer.